What is your workplace horror story? Story 1. Was working the graveyard shift at a Comcast, may have been AT&T at the time, call center. There were TVs everywhere with movies on, as there weren't many calls at midnight. Suddenly, all of the TVs shift to a channel change, down to one of the paid channels. My coworkers and I spot this and start chanting, "Click it, click it." The click goes through. Then the, "Do you accept the charges?" comes up. We chant again and wonder if it goes through. Suddenly, there's a full spread on every television in the call center. We spot 2 managers running full tilt across the cubicles, and shortly after, it got shut off. Apparently, the security guard thought the TV at his station was just for him. Story 2. I worked in a nursing home kitchen for a month back in 2017. Thankfully, it was a temporary job as I was on summer break from university. There were so many things that were up with that place, and I kept on questioning my boss, the head cook, and the care home manager about many things. Firstly, raw meat was stored on the top shelf in the fridge, so unhygienic. Not to mention that some of the kitchen staff had very poor personal hygiene as well. I once saw one of my colleagues drop a boiled egg on the floor. To my horror, he put it straight back on the plate and gave it to a resident. That's before we even get to some of the carers. I knocked on residents' doors when I entered a resident's room. One of the senior carers pulled me up about that, but I told him to do one. Thankfully, the head cook had my back about that. Once I noticed that one of the stair banisters was loose in the dementia unit, which many residents used, and mentioned it to the maintenance guys. When they didn't do anything, I went straight to the care home manager to demand it to be done. She managed to turn the subject around from a health and safety issue to me losing my job if I didn't shut up and toe the line. I was just speechless. Oh, and the activities coordinator was one of the most horrible people I'd ever met. She was in charge when the manager wasn't around, but she was even worse than the manager. She acted so nice to the residents and their families, but she treated all the carers and the kitchen staff like dogs and used to go on frequent power trips. I remember on one evening shift, one of the nurses was unhappy because she thought I had served dessert portions too small. No issue, I offered to fix it. The nurse wasn't having that and got the activities coordinator, and 5 minutes later, she gave me an absolute dressing down in front of all my colleagues. I must admit, I nearly walked out, but I didn't want to screw the guys in the kitchen over either, as they were already short-staffed as it was. It was at that point that I decided, I'm never coming back to this place once this shift is over. The head cook texted me that evening after I'd finished work, and basically told me that whilst he liked me, I was not welcome back at all. Apparently, I'd pissed off the higher-ups for talking back and being disrespectful. I had a feeling it was coming anyway, though, and went back to university to complete my degree. Every time I have a bad day at my current job, I always think, at least I'm not at the nursing home. Thankfully, one of the kitchen staff who I had always got on with quit his job not long after that and reported the nursing home to the council as an anonymous whistleblower. The council sent an inspector to the home and they noticed everything wrong. Apparently, the care home manager got a massive fine, yet somehow still kept her job. To my amusement, though, she complains in the town's Facebook group about being short-staffed. Story 3. Formerly worked at a residential group home, my wife and I. Context. While we were employees, my wife was pregnant and kicked in the lower abdomen by a client, suffered a miscarriage. The director and I disagreed. He was a narcissist. We told him that we would like to adopt a client, a 5-year-old, out of the group home. He did not like that because when the clients are adopted or moved, the facility loses funding. He resorted to yelling at me and looked my wife square in the eyes and said, "How about next time you get pregnant, don't let it die? Think you could do that? If so, we won't have to have conversations like this." First time I ever spent the night in jail, and the first time he ever had a broken nose and eye socket. Worth it. Story 4. Okay. I had this guy who was around 650 pounds coming to the hospital. It took 12 people to move him onto a stretcher. He was coated in rotting flesh since he was sitting in a recliner for so long, and flies were buzzing everywhere. There were so many maggots and flies covering him that we had to shower him outside the department while he laid on the stretcher. We wheeled him into the trauma bay, leaving a trail of brown rot water behind him. Lucky me, I got assigned the job of placing a Foley catheter in him. I had 2 masks, a gown, and as much other PPE as I could find. The smell was not masked in the slightest. As I tried to fight back my dry heaving, I pulled the blanket back that was covering him in an attempt to grab his penis for cleaning before catheter insertion. Story 5. Was working as a CNA, certified nursing assistant, in a nursing home. Had a patient who had just gotten back from the hospital. The hospital sent the patient back with a catheter, But since the patient had not been using a catheter before when they were there, the nurse went and removed the catheter and we were monitoring to make sure the patient urinated. Later in the day, I worked 3 to 11 p.m. then, patient asks for help to go to the bathroom. I get the patient onto the toilet and step out. They were with it and everything, so he put the call light on when he was done. The call light goes on, so I go in there to help him out. I helped him stand up, and that's when I noticed the toilet is full of blood and the man is bleeding like crazy out of his third arm, as I will call it. I sit the man down, quickly pop out to tell the nurse who comes in, sees the carnage, and immediately runs back out to go call 911. While the nurse does her thing, I stay with the man until the paramedics show up. The man is bleeding so much, however, that before the paramedics arrive, the dude passes out from blood loss, and I end up being forced to lower him down onto the floor as I cannot keep his limp body sitting up on the toilet. By the time the paramedics get there, which really isn't that long as they had good response times, I am just sitting there with this guy on the floor with which blood is just everywhere on that floor at this point. I was a CNA for 6 years and saw a lot of stuff, including people dying, but that incident has stuck with me more than anything. Story 6. I worked at a supermarket for 6 years and I saw a few interesting things. This time, when I was working nights for a couple of months, I got to know the night team well. They were sound guys, but there were a few I'd keep my distance from. It became apparent to me one morning when I was washing my hands and saw something in the corner of my eye, a work shoe that contained human poop. After reporting this, and there being some investigations into the phantom pooper, it happened again. This time, a colleague of mine discovered it, having unfortunately put his shoe on before realizing the poop. On one other occasion, a colleague had finished using the toilet and then realized that there was poop strategically balanced on the hook on the cubicle door. Upon this being reported, it was realized that this person could be caught, CCTV. Once the security guard managed to narrow the footage down, the questioning began. However, nothing came from it and no one got caught. I know that when I left the job 10 months ago, the culprit had neither owned up nor been caught. Word got out about 3 people that it could have been, but it just stopped being talked about and everyone moved on. Whether or not this person left, we will never know. All we know is that a man liked to poop into people's shoes and balance them on things. Story 7. My one day working at FedEx. The interview and training process was unremarkable, mostly focused on the evils of unions. Normal propagandist crap. During the training, we had to watch a video on safety regulations. We were expected to behave. After 2 hours of videos, they took me out on the floor for my first day unloading the trucks. One of those safety regulations is that every truck is supposed to have 3 people on it. 2 people would unload, while the third was tasked with checking and marking packages for sorting. 10 minutes in, and my second unloader disappears. A supervisor comes and takes the sorter away, telling me that they'll sort my truck farther down the belt. I'm left to unload the entirety of an 18-wheeler myself. I get an hour in with few problems by moving the lightest packages and praying that someone is going to come to help me soon. 2 hours in, I'm deadlifting 75 to 100-pound packages out of this truck by myself. The last hour of the shift, my supervisor reappears because the truck wasn't being unloaded. I was pinned under 200 pounds of furniture. 2 other loaders were called to free me, and I was reprimanded for not having a second lifter with me. After 2 weeks of rest, a short investigation, and a workman's comp filing later, the supervisor was forced to acknowledge that they were responsible for removing the 2 other workers from my truck. I was asked when they could expect me back to work, and I told them to shove it. I still have back issues years later, and there's a spot about the diameter of a soda can where my back still feels like pins and needles. Story 8. Many years ago, I was a teacher at a very fancy, rich high school, the kind of place where politicians sent their kids. Most of the students were either taken to and from school by chauffeurs or boarded. During a sports event, one kid suddenly had a seizure. He wasn't concussed or anything. He'd just been sitting and watching at the time. There was a flurry of teachers variously keeping other children back, moving chairs out of the way so he didn't hit his head, calling an ambulance, first aid and all that. Of course, once the immediate danger had passed and he was in the recovery position, his parents were called. Due to the emergency, their family's staff let the call go through to the father directly. "Mr. Parent, this is son's teacher at school. Your son is okay now, but he's just had a seizure. An ambulance is—" "No, he didn't." Sorry? I don't think I was clear. Your son had a seizure. He's No, my son has never had a seizure. Good day." And he hung up. Talking to the poor boy later revealed that this had happened before. He was told it was dehydration or other such things. People don't usually remember much during seizures, so that helped convince him that it was minor, I suppose. He was unaware of the twitching, vomiting, and lack of consciousness. He just remembered being with his friends one moment, then suddenly waking up with a huge headache. Among the rich and wannabe rich, parents will sometimes doctor shop to get their children diagnosed with whatever, as an attention-seeking, aren't we unique sort of thing. But among the very rich and influential, it's kind of the reverse. They have incredible power and freedom, but only if they fit into a certain image. Epilepsy is an unacceptable health condition. His father basically had decided that his son did not have any such disorder, and being rich and powerful, it's easy to convince others. I still feel absolutely awful for that poor boy. Story 9. Gonna keep names and places out of this because I still have an active contract. At the beginning of every summer, we would have a big influx of new hires as students were getting out of school and people were generally just looking for work. Anyways, one of our new hires was this burly guy that looked like he was in his 30s or 40s. Dude had a sleeve of tattoos and wore a Confederate flag bandana. Anyways, he comes in on his first day and almost immediately gets on our supervisor for not doing anything. I don't know if this dude was aware that he was chirping at his supervisor. The supervisor ignores this for like 10 minutes before saying, "This is your first day. Do you really want to get a bad rep with your supervisor?" This dude keeps spouting off at the soup. All the while, the soup is telling him to just go home and he could try to come back tomorrow with a better attitude. Eventually, the dude gets all up in the soup's face and pushes him. Soup has had enough at this point and goes in to slug the dude. The dude whips a gun out of the back of his pants and blasts the soup right in the stomach. Everyone flips out and starts running at this point. I immediately left through a window, so I don't know what happened next, but from what I heard, the dude with the gun just kind of stood there in shock, like he didn't know what just happened. Cops came and surrounded the building and dragged the dude out. The supervisor survived, but had to relearn how to walk. Story 10. A pharmacy I won't name in New Jersey had a Script Pro automated dispensing machine. About 200 different drugs could be loaded into it. A technician loaded the children chewable vitamin cell with methotrexate, a pretty serious chemotherapeutic drug. It was dispensed about 18 times by 3 different pharmacists before the error was caught. Over a dozen children chewed methotrexate every morning with their breakfast. It was quietly hushed up. Story 11. I was the boss, and some guy wasn't paying attention and had his arm on the bar behind him on the forklift he was backing up. He backed up right into a container and all but severed his arm. Just a small flap of skin was holding it on. He ran inside the building, spurting blood all over, and I ran over and stopped him, sat him down, and got one of the guys to get me some stuff for an improvised tourniquet. I held his severed arm under mine, and I squeezed the upper arm to slow the flow until I could get the tourniquet on and tight. All the while, I was getting covered in his blood from head to toe. I finally got it stopped and sat there trying to keep him calm while the paramedics were on the way. After they took over, I asked the firemen that accompanied them if they could blast me off with the fire hose. They blasted all the blood off, but my clothes were ruined. I sat outside until I dried and then went home and showered well and threw the stained clothes away. I got dressed and went back to work to help the crew clean up the blood and toss the chair he was on into the trash. I could taste his blood the rest of the day. It even got up my nose. I didn't notice until I went home again, but my mustache and goatee were stained from the blood too. I had to shave it clean. They were able to reattach his arm, but it never worked right again. He went on permanent disability afterward. Story 12. I wasn't there that day when it happened, but heard some of the details. I may be off, but here it goes. 2 maintenance guys were up in a scissor lift, working on an overhead indoor crane. Someone on the floor grabbed the remote for the other crane and started to move it. One maintenance guy yelled "duck" and ducked. The other turned to see what was happening and apparently was crushed between the 2 cranes and then fell out of the lift. I don't know how true this is, but apparently I got a call from my idiot team lead telling me work was shut down for at least the day, probably longer. He didn't mention the guy dying, just mentioned it was awesome to have a long weekend. Story 13. Back in the 70s, I used to work on an oil drilling rig. Rigs run around the clock in 3 to 8 hour shifts. My crew arrived at the rig to find that the rig wasn't drilling. The rig was in standby mode. The drill pipe was rotating and the drill bit just suspended off the bottom of the hole. And the crew that we were going to relieve was not there. The only person there was the rig's tool pusher, which is a fancy title for the boss. The boss came into the driller's shack and told us what had happened during the previous shift. It's wintertime and everyone has to dress warm. You work on a drilling rig. You are going to fight the elements. But what had happened was one of the workers crawled down inside the drawworks, which is basically the power lift equipment that controls the power drum the cable winds up on that lifts the drill pipe in and out of the hole. Down in the drawworks where the crew member entered, there is a high-speed jack shaft that couples the diesel engines to the transmission to the drawworks. The jack shaft has a coupler in it that allows the shaft to be taken apart if need be. The jack shaft spins around 1500 RPM at ideal speed. The worker that was down in this tight area had backed into this jack shaft while he was greasing out components in that area. The coupler he backed into had a grease zerk that caught his clothing and just started winding him up on the shaft. It spun him up and pulled him through a 2x2 foot hole and threw him up against the drawwork motors. He hit hard enough that it broke the fuel filters and lines off of one of the motors. An ambulance had come and got him and took him to the hospital. He was lucky. The top of the grease zerk, after catching his clothes, had left a red scrape just up his spine, just barely scratching his skin. He was banged up really bad from being dragged through that hole he didn't really fit through, and from being slammed against the engine. He came away with a broken collarbone, cuts, bruises, and 5 broken ribs. A very fortunate person to have survived. Story 14. Not sure if school counts, but last November we had a school shooting scare. So everyone's on lockdown, including the hundreds of people at the school play. Everyone's scared, and I'm trying to calm down the girl next to me who's having a panic attack. 10 minutes pass, and I think, oh, I haven't heard anything yet, and things don't seem so bad. Then I heard a boom, and the lights went out, and all hell broke loose in my class. I start thinking that this was a coordinated attack by multiple people, and it might be the 6 guys who sexually harassed me in a bathroom a week prior, and now they want revenge because I can press charges against them. Another 90 minutes pass, and we hear movement outside. It's cops and the principal clearing the building. Turns out that a mom spread a rumor that there was someone with a gun on campus, and the power outage was caused by a car crash across town. Safe to say there was an early release that day. Story 15. I don't work there anymore. This was an internship I had in construction management, asphalt paving contractor. Several years ago, an inspector who was hard of hearing was out on the job site. He did not realize he was in the way of an asphalt compactor. The compactors move really slowly, and their brakes are not built to abruptly stop, at least the old ones, seeing as you could see these things coming with more than enough time to move. Several guys on the equipment tried yelling at him to get out of the way, thinking he would right away, but he didn't hear them. The guy on the compactor obviously applied the brakes, but the others realized too late that he wasn't getting out of the way. You can imagine what happened next. They said the sounds were unimaginable. He didn't make a noise, but his body being crushed did. They had to scrape him off the pavement. The guy on the compactor took an office job after this and now has severe PTSD. Story 16. This is from my old job. It was a charity shop, so we relied a lot on donations to resell. Now there is a list of things we don't take as standard, and some we will refuse for it being too big or because in the past they don't sell. And one day this woman comes in with a glass TV stand and we say we won't take it because they don't sell. Any reasonable person would have accepted that, but this woman chose to throw the stand down, causing it to shatter, leaving broken glass on the floor and in the frame. She walked out, leaving me and another employee to clean up the mess, which involved breaking the rest of the glass to not cut our hands, sweeping it up, and disassembling the frame. The kicker is, afterward, as I'm taking out the pieces, she's around the back of the shop and has a go at me for throwing away her donation, which she had just broken in our shop.